Chapter 28. Flying Low and Long. The clouds above us had been very low, dark, and solid. They forced us down to only 200 feet above the ground. It was another stormy flight made long ago, with Phyllis and Gordon in the old Rapide, one none of us will ever forget. Rain had struck our plane with a fierce drumming as we flew. 1,000 needles of water seemed to be trying to pierce the taut fabric of the wings and fuselage. We could see almost nothing ahead. We could scarcely see the Nile below as we tried to follow every bend, fearful of losing sight of our only landmark. It had seemed an eternity before we reached Malakal. From the mid-70s, MAF came into a long period of operation under low, heavy clouds. Occasionally, there would be a slight lift in the cloud base, but there remained little room for manoeuvre and unrelenting demands for concentration. Sometimes, as the clouds pressed even lower, we were barely above the treetops and possible disaster. These clouds were not produced by the weather. They were clouds of financial difficulty, just as real and even more oppressively persistent. Flying a small plane, skimming just above the ground under a low cloud base, can be very exciting at first. But after a while, it becomes extremely tiring. Obstacles may suddenly appear. Danger is very close. Quick, evasive action may be essential. The strain increases with time, and if the clouds never lift, you may be heading for disaster. That's what our financial situation was like during those years. When, much later, many businesses and families began to undergo similar pressures in the long, drawn-out economic depression, I understood how they felt. We had faced low finances often enough before. What was the difference now? True, we had often lived with little money, learning to trust God and finding He never failed us. But in those early years, it was just the few of us together. Now we had to learn the same lessons again, but for a much larger and more expensive organization, and over a considerably longer period. We were now responsible for serving churches and missions in 5 different countries, an ever-changing kaleidoscope of dangers and opportunities. The challenges were enormous, but financial support was needed to match them. I was used to challenge, but this was different. Sometimes it was a nightmare. There were, in fact, many nights through the long months and years when I found it hard to sleep. The burden of the work would creep through my restless subconscious and wake me to concern and prayer. What worried me was that the lack of money meant pressures on our staff and restrictions on what we could do. I had a fear that we might fail in the work to which God had called us. Everything involving finance had to be examined with a fine-tooth comb. Where could we afford to go ahead? What could we cut back? How would our people cope with the restrictions? It was wearying and time-consuming, and sometimes I felt like opting out. Nevertheless, as before, though the way was hard, God sustained us. Even below dark clouds, hope had wings. There had been considerable changes at our headquarters in the UK. In 1970, Steve and Kay Stevens, having given 20 years of self-sacrificial service to MAF, had moved on to become early members of the National Festival of Light, forerunner of today's CARE organization. It was in their blood to pioneer in needy areas. Their vision and fellowship had been of the utmost value in the early years of MAF. I don't know what we'd have done without them. I had asked Tom Frank to replace Steve as Home Director. Then, at the end of 1973, Phyllis and I also moved back to England. Our planned 12 months return to Kenya had by then stretched to 8.5 years. It was time to reinforce the UK base of MAF again. Our overseas operations depended on supplies and support from home, just as any army overseas relies on its home country to provide for its needs. There were other reasons for our return. Our eldest child, Becky, was already married and living in Canada. But John needed to get into a job or further study in England, and it would be good for Priscilla, who had just finished primary education in Kenya, to complete her schooling at home. Every missionary family has to face decisions about its children's education and location and discover God's will. Phyllis had acted as General Treasurer for MAF for nearly 20 years. For some time, she'd felt that the growing size and complexity of the work called for a chartered accountant. Ken Taylor, who had been with us for a year in Nairobi, also returned to the UK and took responsibility for supervising and developing our financial systems. Phyllis continued for some years more as accounts administrator. Mr. Adams, after 20 years of dedicated voluntary service to MAF, retired. We missed his godly presence. The MAF offices were eventually moved out of London and our headquarters established at Folkestone in Kent, where housing and offices were cheaper. From there, as General Director, I made constant visits to Africa to maintain my close links with the work. The work of missions is surely done now. Missionaries aren't needed anymore, are they? Aren't people like Bishop Yohana Madinda from Tanzania and Bishop Festo Kevingere from Uganda coming to this country to challenge us? Aren't there the Louis Palaus from South America? What about people like Yonggi Cho from Korea? Isn't the church overseas growing more rapidly than it is at home? Isn't there a greater need here than out in Africa? Who are we to send people to Africa anyway? Look at the poor moral state of our own nation, and even our church. Such sentiments were frequently voiced during the 1970s and early 80s. Interest in mission waned. Giving was drastically reduced, some of it moving away from missions to other Christian relief agencies. Giving to MAF declined, just as our work and opportunities were increasing. There were other financial strains. In 5 years, the pound dropped to half its previous value. Most of our aircraft, spares and other aviation equipment came from the US. Fuel also was priced in dollars. As a result, our costs rose tremendously. Our services to churches and missions overseas had already been heavily subsidized. Now we had to provide bigger subsidies than ever to enable them to use the planes. Political turmoil, hostility, and rapid change in Africa increased our difficulties. 3 out of the 5 countries where we were flying saw serious coups, disturbances, restrictions, and costly evacuations. Some underwent several changes of government. One political event after another tumbled across our scene, disrupting our work, bringing loss of income and heavy additional expenses. We'd had to leave the Sudan twice. The coup in Ethiopia had severely restricted our flying. Planes sitting idle were expensive. Heavy overhead costs continued, while fare revenues dwindled to a trickle. Restrictions and closure in Chad aggravated the situation. So did a severe fuel shortage in East Africa. The new Tanzania program brought additional demands and expenses. Our bills were frightening. For a period, I had to ask that all orders for spares from our programs came through me so that I could check them personally. In the years that followed, the financial situation fluctuated. For the most part, we were forced to fly very low and long and to cope with the resultant stresses. At one stage, I had to ask that departmental budgets be cut by 40%. At another, we went to zero budgeting. Departments had to justify minutely every item of expenditure. Contingency plans and worst-case scenarios became realities. We came within a few weeks of being bankrupt. But we still believed God would work out his purposes. Some changes were particularly painful. Peter Empson, one of our experienced pilots, had flown extensively in Ethiopia and had been a program manager there. After Cecil Davis left, he'd supervised all our operational programs for me for 3 years. Then he'd come to England to start a training course, teaching pilots the specialized skills they would need for flying with MAF in Africa. Financial stringency obliged us to give up the course, and Peter had to leave. It was sad to see him and his family go. While all our managers had to live with the results and restrictions of this period, as chief executive, I obviously took the brunt of the pressures. Leadership is lonely. Hudson Taylor, pioneer of the China Inland Mission, and George Muller, the man of faith who founded the Muller orphanages in Bristol, had never publicized their needs. They looked to God alone to move Christians to meet them. In MAF's early days, we had been greatly inspired by their stories and reluctant to mention financial requirements to others. And God had supplied our need too. But the situation had changed. People weren't giving. We spent much time agonizing and praying about what we should do. Should we only pray? Should we tell our supporters more about our difficult situation? Or would that indicate lack of faith? At this time, a Christian organization I knew sent me information about their own serious financial position. I responded with a gift, then realized that I wouldn't have done so unless they had told me. Why shouldn't we do that in MAF? The way God had blessed us in the past might not be his way for the future. God was not limited to one way or another. Over the years, there had been other objections to making our needs known. We mustn't fish in other people's pools. We mustn't rob other missions. There is only one cake. We mustn't take more than our fair slice of it. MAF mustn't take advantage of the glamour of flying to attract giving away from traditional missions. It was important that we should not compete, since our very purpose was to serve and help other missions. But our low-profile approach was preventing us from doing just that. MAF is the best-kept Christian secret in the UK, someone claimed. We've got to go high-profile, said our board members. We realized that any publicity given to mission work helps all missions. We had always tried to stimulate general mission interest. So we started to give more information, not only about our opportunities, but also about the funds required to meet them. MAF is a complex and unique organization, a mix of professional aviation and Christian mission. It needs a board aware of mission principles and practice, able to promote the strict disciplines essential to aviation, possessing the financial acumen of business, understanding difficult overseas situations, and above all, strong in Christian faith. Our board included chartered accountants like Herbert Adams and Ken Taylor. Peter Clark, a solicitor, put in a tremendous amount of legal work for us, playing a vital role in this and in other ways for many years. He visited the work in Africa with me a number of times, as did other board members. Some members, like Mr. Adams, were church leaders. From the start, our experienced senior managers were key members of the board, bringing to it essential information on the overseas work, national churches, missions management, field and flying operations. Our legal constitution also required me, as chief executive, to act as chairman. More recently, Charity Commission rules have excluded full-time staff from membership of boards of registered charities. Such members are considered to have too much of a vested interest. Even though our senior managers can no longer vote at the meetings, they can still attend and contribute their experience and knowledge. I sought to bring everything of importance to the board, who constitutionally had the ultimate decision in policy matters. No major decisions were made without its approval. At this time, our financial situation came under especially careful scrutiny at every meeting. But however desperate it appeared, as a board we never said, "Should we continue?" We asked rather, "How do we continue?" Because the financial situation made it so difficult to plan, we issued a special statement of intent at the end of 1976. It would have been hard to continue without it. God has called MAF into being in the first place. God is continuing to bless and use the work overseas. If we lose faith and draw back, we will fall short of His call. We must monitor the financial situation closely, prayerfully seeking God to guide us. We believe MAF will become more, not less, effective than in the past. The statement went on to set out a wide-ranging series of overseas objectives, including those in which we were already involved. We went ahead with renewed confidence.